More trouble in the South China Sea. The Philippines looks caught in a David and Goliath battle with China after Beijing fires a water cannon at a Philippine military vessel. It's not the first time we've seen such an exchange, but how much could it escalate global tension between major powers and put us all at risk? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the South China Sea. On August 5th, the Chinese Coast Guard intercepted and fired water cannon at a Philippine ship carrying supplies to their troops stationed at the second Thomas Shoal in the contested Spratly Islands. It's the latest in a string of incidents that has escalated tensions in the South China Sea. Now, China says they have repeatedly tried to resolve differences with the Philippines. That's a claim dismissed by Manila. Here's a closer look.
A territorial dispute between China and the Philippines over the South China Sea is escalating. In early August, the Chinese Coast Guard harassed a Philippine supply boat using water cannon on the much smaller vessel. Manila has also accused Beijing of using vessels crewed by militia members, nicknamed the Little Blue Men. The Philippine boat was en route to supply military personnel in the second Thomas Shoal. The Philippines deliberately grounded the Sierra Madre, a retired warship, on the shoal in 1999 to stamp its territorial claim. Since then, it's been a flashpoint between the two sides. Beijing has defended the actions of its Coast Guard.
We suggested that two sides hold talks as soon as possible on ways to manage the situation at Rene Chao. The Philippines, however, chose to ignore China's goodwill and sincerity and went ahead with sending construction materials for repairing and reinforcing the grounded military vessel on a large scale.
The Philippines described it as aggressive, dangerous, and unlawful, and the military said it will supply more ships and fishing vessels to the disputed area.
We continue to assert our sovereignty. We continue to assert our territorial rights in the face of all of these challenges, and consistent with the international law and UNCLOS especially.
The second Thomas Shoal is inside the Philippines' maritime borders, according to the internationally agreed convention. But China claims sovereignty over a large part of the South China Sea. A 2016 tribunal in The Hague ruled that China's territorial claims were not valid. But it has continued to boost its presence in the region through military deployments, construction of islands, and Coast Guard patrols.
China's sovereignty and rights in the South China Sea have been formed through long-term historical practice with sufficient historical and legal basis, and are not affected by illegal arbitration under any circumstances.
For years, the Philippines have maintained a pro-China agenda, but that has begun to change under Marcos Jr. Manila has restored its defense ties with Washington, giving the US military access to 4 new sites. And in April, the two nations held the largest joint military drills to date.
Such actions by the PRC are inconsistent with the international law and are the latest in repeated threats to the status quo in the South China Sea, directly threatening regional peace and stability.
Beijing says the US is utilizing the issue to sow confusion and discord, suggesting that what looks like a regional dispute on the surface has potential to escalate into an international conflict.
So, how much has this latest incident changed the equation in the South China Sea? Well, joining me now to debate that are, from Beijing, political and economic affairs commentator Einar Tangen. From Washington is Robert Manning, a distinguished senior fellow with the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Project at the Stimson Center. And from Taipei is Asia political risk analyst Ross Feingold. Thanks all so much for being with me. Einar, I'll start with you. As you know, it's been labeled another example of China's aggressive behavior. From the footage, at least, it does seem as much. And the last time you saw kind of a similar exchange, you thought it might actually be staged. So first tell us what you make of what you've seen from this kind of latest standoff.
Well, I've seen the pictures. The Chinese government is put out that this was in fact staged. They said that they were American airplanes overhead, and that the camera angles were absolutely perfect. The Chinese have been trying to prevent the resupply of this grounded ship that's been sitting on that shoals for quite some time. It is being resupplied by air at this juncture, but at this juncture, I mean, China believes that this is just another pressure point that the U.S. is trying to make PR points on.
Okay, explain quickly why it is being resupplied by air.
Because China has asked them to remove this grounded ship from a shoal. It's a feature. It's not really an island. But the Philippines are saying that this is their occupation of it, and that by being there, that they're asserting control. So this is about the geopolitics and the South China Sea disputes. There are many of them between various countries. We're talking about Vietnam, Philippines, Taiwan, PRC maintain the same position, Burundi, Indonesia, and Malaysia. So, and it's not just everybody versus China. They all have cross claims against each other that have yet to be settled.
Okay, but I'll turn to Robert now. It's interesting to hear the word occupation being used, while the Philippines has so clearly said it's their sovereignty, that this is territory they've claimed and should rightly have, even they say according to international courts, for decades now.
Well, remember, this is not just China and Vietnam has a claim, Taiwan has a claim to it also. I mean, that's the problem. There's no clear basis for ownership of these shoals and reefs and so on. And so you have countries, all of which have occupied some piece of claimed territory, as the Philippines have. And I don't see that they're doing anything different from what the Chinese have done. Although I think in the case of the Philippines, it's within their territorial limits, so it makes more sense. I think the Chinese claim, which has been refuted by the International Court at The Hague, is that the entire 88% of the South China Sea was within what's called the 9-dash line that belongs to China. And so I think this is the basis of what you might call a Chinese Monroe Doctrine, similar to the U.S. old claim on Latin America from the 19th century. And so this is the problem, and there's no clear way to do it. One trend we have seen is within the ASEAN states, for example, Vietnam and Philippines are working out disputed claims. Indonesia has done that, I think, with Malaysia. And so I think that's a start. But I think we'd probably all be much better off if China went back to Deng Xiaoping's policy, which was, this is too difficult to resolve. Let's put it off and jointly develop the resources.
Okay, Einar, I'm going to have you comment on that in just a second. But first, let me get to Ross, because, as Robert was saying, there's no clear basis really for ownership anyway of this territory. So why does China kind of feel a right to challenge what it calls an occupation of that shoal?
Well, the reality is if we follow the old adage that might makes right, I mean, from the perspective of China, they do have a very powerful navy. Add into that the Coast Guard and their civilian maritime militia as well. Frankly, they just have an enormous amount of resources to assert their claims throughout the South China Sea. And the other claimants, as far as what their military capabilities are, lag very, very far behind. And Vietnam has always maintained a fairly strong land military, but they're catching up with their naval capabilities. And then when it comes to the Philippines, frankly, they've underinvested in their Navy as well as their Air Force for literally decades. And they just have very great difficulty asserting their own claims. But this is one claim that they have asserted by grounding that old Navy World War II ship on the shoal decades ago, and they've continued to base personnel there and to resupply it. So when it comes to this specific claim, at least from the Filipino perspective, not only is it their sovereign territory, but there's a status quo when it comes to this particular shoal. And from the Philippine perspective, China is now trying to upset that. And then it brings in the United States because of the United States-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty.
Right. Yeah, before you go further with that, I do want to address the issues involving the U.S. here. But it's interesting as well, that you note that the Philippines has underinvested in its Navy from your perspective. And I think we have some pictures of that ship itself because there are men stationed on it, and it is in a miserable condition. So it's pretty symbolic of what you're saying. But still, China feels it's an occupational threat somehow. But let me ask Einar, do you think China maybe needs to be a little bit more careful about how aggressive it looks? Because here it is making potential enemies within ASEAN, which is a group that it would like to have harmony with.
No, I'd agree with you. I mean, China has a big stake in ASEAN. They view the U.S. as trying to leverage the South China Sea disputes against China. It does not look good, even though China was just using water cannon. It still doesn't look good internationally. So they have some work to do there if they're going to win the PR game. But Ross, you have to be a little bit more clear here. Taiwan and the PRC have exactly the same claims as affects these islands and these features. And quite frankly, as Robert pointed out, this is no man's land. So what you've had now is everybody grabbing land. As they say in law, possession is 9/10 of the law. So at this juncture, people just see this as a land grab. I think China and other nations, ASEAN in particular, need to come together. And they need to sort out exactly how they can share these resources. I'd agree. Deng Xiaoping's idea was to share and to create a united basis for going forward. And I think that's what's necessary. And there are routes that are open. If China was to propose and ASEAN was to accept that those areas that are disputed would be put into a joint custody, in essence, for those who are neighboring it, and that the resources could be developed and then shared. I think this would go a long way toward settling this.
Einar, but it's interesting to hear your
Andrew,
analysis
I just want
of
to
it.
add one thing.
Yeah, no, I want to stick with you. I just wanted you to clarify something you said earlier, because you sound very rational about this, and what you're saying makes sense. But China still manages to kind of claim the entire expanse of the South China Sea. And when you look at this latest skirmish, it looks as if it is being aggressive about it. And so it's not just PR. We also have shown the map before. You and I have discussed this. Why does China still think it has this vast right to the South China Sea?
First off, it wasn't started by the PRC. It was actually the Republic, which was under control of Chiang Kai-shek, and then which later became, he retreated to Taiwan. So at this point, China says, look, we inherited this. We're not going to give it up. The problem is, what does it mean? If you go back to the original cartographer, I mean, any map that you look at, right, the only way you can read it is through the cartographer. And that means that you have to look at the bottom and see what does each line mean. If it's a red line, it means that it's an established boundary. If it's a dashed line, what does that mean? And this is the ambiguity that has led to a lot of these issues, with China asserting a historical area of common interest, sole interest, et cetera. It wasn't clear. It wasn't even this government. So, on a popular basis, it is very difficult to give up land which people perceive as theirs, or in this case, water. So China is going forward with this idea that there has to be some sort of resolution. They've talked about codes of conduct. But I think it's clear, Andrea, to everybody that this is not going to be settled militarily. This idea that pushing more weapons and that countries arming themselves is going to make this better, I think that's naive in the extreme.
Okay, so Einar says it's not going to be settled militarily. Other people don't actually see it that way. I mean, you've said before that every escalation accumulates into a death spiral in this region and that it's a matter of time before the bow could really break. Do you still feel that way? Unfortunately, it looks like we've lost Richard's connection. Ross, I'll let you comment on that.
Sure. Well, the challenge with addressing that a military solution is obviously not the direction that we want to go to because of the ramifications of that. is in the islands that China occupies. They've engaged in a lot of land reclamation. They've built, as I said earlier, China does have a very powerful military. And on many of these islands, they've built modern military facilities. They've expanded the runways, which allows them to project power throughout their vast claims with air power. It's been in the news in the last 24 hours about another island in the Pratos, which is also a chain in the South China Sea, where China is expanding an airport, and that's for military purposes. So China has a head start in the militarization, and that makes any negotiation difficult because, well, that's not nonsense, because the fact is, over the past 10 years, China has militarized a number of islands, and they're far ahead of that than other countries.
You're glossing over the hundreds of bases that the U.S. has, including Air Force bases, reactivating Longbao Air Force Base, which was used during the Vietnam War.
This is not a discussion about
if China
US
is
military
reacting
bases
to the
in
U.S.
the Middle East or Africa, right? We're talking about the South
No,
China Sea.
Look, Russ, you can
this
say
is a region that China has militarized.
The U.S. militarized it way before China did. 80% of China's energy imports and 40% of China's total trade passes through the South China Sea. The U.S. has embarked on a containment strategy against China. It is very real to China that the U.S. could use its hundreds of bases, all right, in order to try to blockade and keep China from prospering. Without 80% of its energy imports, China would grind to a halt. And it's not just energy, resources, et cetera. So this claim that somehow China
I'm not sure how that helps China reach an agreement with its neighbors in ASEAN about joint exploitation of resources, or even settling.
That would be the best solution.
I'll tell you what. Let me get Robert back. We have this connection. Robert, on China's neighbors in particular, President Biden has actually said he plans to visit Vietnam soon, and some see that as an effort to build relationships with China's neighbors to isolate China, as per Einar's points, along its own borders. So do you think that's a wise strategy? And does the U.S. have a chance at doing that with Vietnam, for example?
I think U.S.-Vietnam relations have become very robust, but I think there's some unrealistic expectations on the part of the White House. Vietnam has been fighting China for 2,000 years, and they'll always balance China against others, but they're never going to go after China or make a choice that defines China as an enemy. But I think you need to look. China, the mindset in China is that we've had a couple of bad centuries. Now we're back, and we're not going to be victims anymore. And so they're asserting themselves all over. They have claims not only in the South China Sea. They question the Senkaku Islands that controlled by Japan. They've even raised questions about Japan's sovereignty over Okinawa. And I also would add, they've raised, occasionally you see articles in the Chinese academics talking about the Russian Far East as part of a Chinese claim. So I think we're looking at, the Qi dynasty, and the irony is that their foreign policy seems to be a series of own goals that have alienated much of Asia and much of Europe, and they don't seem to care.
And there's also the issue, I mean, you spoke a little, you just mentioned Russia as more of an adversary for China, but Ross, China and Russia are now conducting, of course, joint naval exercises. Where do you think that could go? And should the U.S. kind of be mindful then of provoking, any of the players in this? Because that could be a powerful alignment there between China and Russia.
They already are clearly aligned. They describe their relationship in lots of nice language to indicate the strength of that relationship, whether it's on the trade side or the security side. Obviously, China has been reluctant to criticize Russia over Ukraine. So the U.S. has to be concerned about that. And there's still critics in the U.S. who say that the U.S. has played this wrong, that the U.S. should not have alienated Russia and should have looked to play Russia off of China the way the U.S. looked to play China off of Russia during the Cold War. But the reality is, for the moment, that's a very strong relationship. So what does that mean for the U.S.? Well, obviously, and I think it would be silly even to criticize it. The U.S. has to take the necessary steps to defend its own interests. I mean, that's just the realities of geopolitics. So whether that's things that the U.S. does along its common borders with Russia, for example, in Alaska, we have nearby incursions by Russian aircraft, or working with its allies, whether that's Japan or other countries. The U.S. is going to have to do what's necessary to defend its own interests as the China-Russia alliance continues to deepen.
Einar, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, do you expect China to look at strengthening the China-Russia relationship as you feel the U.S. continues to maneuver to more isolate China and turn its kind of ASEAN allies against it?
Well, I mean, Russia's using the old line that you're either for us or against us. It's also possible to have a myriad of different interests and positions on things, and that's the fact is with Russia and China. China sees Russia as a potential ally in its the deepening conflict with the United States. This idea that they have a security alliance is completely false. Any suggestion by Ross that they have one is not true. I don't know why he says that or tries to infer it. China was not happy about what happened in Ukraine. They want peace. They had substantial assets and Belt and Road routes through Ukraine, which gave them an alternative to Russia. If they had just, quote, trusted Russia, as my colleague is trying to infer, they would have just gone through the Trans-Siberian Railway. It's there. There's no any kind of economic or security threats, etc. It would have been very easy. Obviously, China does not want to put all of its eggs in one basket. So right now, this is just another part of the disinformation campaign that the U.S. likes to put out, that if you're not with us, somehow you're against us, and you're all in league against us if you're against one of any of our policies. And we've seen this. We've seen this in what happened to Japan in the 1970s. When the U.S. decided that Japan was a threat, they acted quickly, resulting in Japan having to sign in 1986 the Plaza Accord. Interestingly, Japan's economy is now smaller today in real dollar terms than it was when it signed the Plaza Accord. So the U.S., a country that has only had 17 years in its entire history since its revolution of peace, is in fact well known a rogue nation that is going around asserting and coercing other countries.
Robert, I could see you didn't disagree on some of the points that Einar was making, but clarify what you can.
Okay, well, first of all, the glue holding China and Russia together is opposition to U.S.-dominated world order. When you talk to Chinese, you very rarely hear a good word said about Russia. They have a long history of antagonism, and China has been very uncomfortable from the beginning with the Ukraine war. Many Chinese that I talk to think it was a really dumb decision by Putin. They've been appalled at the performance of the Russian military, who they thought this is their great ally. And so, they say Russia as a junior partner, and you have a troubled Chinese economy that is trying to, in some ways, support an even more troubled, declining Russian economy. And so I don't think there's any love lost there. And I think the U.S. has not played things ideally, but I think that there was room for cooperation with China on Ukraine. And in fact, the recent peace summit in Saudi Arabia, the U.S. and China both attended and spoke with each other about it. And if you go back to their February 12-point plan, there are some elements in there that Zelensky himself was very positive about, including a Chinese pledge to help in the reconstruction of Ukraine. So I think that and that's why the Chinese have tried to portray themselves as neutral although obviously it's a very pro-Russian neutrality.
Okay.
But they've been careful.
Oh, sorry, Robert Manning. I was hoping you could finish your thought there, but yeah, I was saying okay because we are indeed out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. So I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us, and I'm sure we will be talking about this again in the months to come. So that's all for now. Thanks to our viewers for being with us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.